I always tell my students to write in English if they plan to publish in English. Because if they write in Russian and send the paper to a translator, no matter how good that translator is, the writer's thinking and organizing and presenting will unconsciously adhere to the Russian tradition with Russian syntax and passive voice, likely emphasizing theory while neglecting specifics, all of which will prevent them getting published in English. The only time that I really recommend the use of a translator, and my apologies to all translators here, is that when the writer's written and spoken English skills are so poor that no other options are available. And then, in my experience, even with a good translation, the paper will need a complete rewriting, sentence by sentence, phrase by phrase, to have any hopes of getting published in a good journal. Why? Simply because good writing in Russian and good writing in English are different. That's all. So I do not presuppose to know the rhetorical conventions of Russian, although the Russian scholars with whom I continue to work have taught me many. But I do know the rhetorical conventions of academic English. And I reiterate that none of what I'm saying today is right or wrong or good or bad. It simply is. The implicit, unstated, unwritten conventions of English academic writing are what they are. And whether we like them or not, we have to use them when writing in English if we want to get published. So, what are they? First, the most important principle in English rhetoric is that the writer has to do all of the work, so that the reader is essentially spoon-fed the information. The writer has to frame, that is, to contextualize the entire paper, to frame every section, to frame every paragraph, so that the reader doesn't have to think as much as to simply absorb the information like a big sponge and then think about it later and say, what do I think? Do I agree or do I disagree? But the reader should never have to struggle to understand the writing. In other words, English is a completely writer-responsible language. All the responsibility falls on the writer and zero responsibility on the reader. That is not because English readers are lazy or stupid, but because we are taught from the time we learn to read that doing all the work of making things clear is the writer's job. It's a cultural difference. In most European languages, the reader is expected to participate more actively in various digressions or shifts of subject. These often theoretical digressions are acceptable in Russian, German, and French, partly because the reader is seen as having a more active role to play in following the thinking of the writer. And of course, from an English-speaking point of view, there's nothing wrong with theory. But in English, the writer has to introduce and present the theory in a way that conforms to the expectations of the Anglo-American readership. In other words, a writer can't just take Foucault or Bourdieu and plop them down in the middle of a paragraph with no introduction as to why it's in this paragraph, why the theory is relevant here, or why the reader should know about it now instead of 3 pages earlier or 3 pages later. So in other words, the writer involves the reader in his or her thinking so that the reader follows as if the reader were living in the writer's mind. But the writer cannot keep anything back and say, oh, I know this, but I think my reader knows that, so I'll just skip it. Just like in mathematics, you can't skip some part that everybody knows. Every part of the formula needs to be there, and it's the same way in writing in English. It's simply different. So, unfortunately for Russian scholars, academic English is the world's only 100% writer-responsible language. And you're stuck with it. Temporarily, maybe in 100 years, it will be Russian or Chinese, who knows, but right now it's English. Ironically, the purpose of rhetoric in English used to be to sway the emotions of an audience. But language and culture are inextricably connected, and a cultural change in both England and North America over 200 years ago, led to the renewed popularity of Aristotle and Aristotelian empiricism, which is based on proofs. The purpose of rhetoric then shifted away from persuading people's emotions to convincing their minds, and to doing so with Aristotelian empirical logic. Both speakers and writers had to not only prove their point, but show the reader step by step that they had proved it and how they had proved it. They now had to carefully involve the listener or reader in their thinking process. We have a saying in the United States that we laugh about when we say, but we say it because it's true, and it's about writing, and it goes like this. First you tell them what you're going to tell them. Then you tell them what you told them. In other words, you introduce your paper by letting your reader know in the first 3 paragraphs what the paper is going to cover. Then you cover exactly what you said you were going to cover, and then you conclude by reminding the reader of what you said and pulling all of the minor conclusions together into one clear conclusion, either by stating a position and showing that you have proved the position, or by pointing the way ahead to future research. So let's recap so far. To get published in English, Russian scholars need to learn to write in the active voice, unless the journal to which they're submitting uses exclusively the passive voice, or primarily. They need to write with reasonably short sentences and paragraphs, all organized according to Aristotelian empirical logic, with all the details and specific information necessary to support their argument. These papers must be based on empirical research, not summaries of their own or other people's thinking, and the writers must carefully market their niche to the readers as valuable enough to be included in the literature. The best way to find the logic inherent in an argument is to outline the paper step by step before writing even a word of it, so that you figure out what the entire argument of your paper will be before you start writing.